My name is Ryley, and you are listening to the Ryley Heppner podcast. Well, your new book, Abby, is Films for All Seasons, Experiencing the Church Year at the Movies. I wonder if, before we even get to the book, could you tell me about your journey into writing about film? Like, where did your passion for movies begin? When did you realize you had a critical eye for unpacking and dissecting films?
For sure. So I've basically wanted to be a film critic since almost since I could read.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I grew up I spent my elementary school years in Chicago, and at the time the Chicago Tribune had a really robust film criticism section. They put out like a weekend preview of like entertainment in town that would like it came as like a supplement every Friday. And so
Okay.
I would I have like very vivid memories of like sitting in my parents' room with them reading the paper, and like I we'd read the comics. I'd get through the comics, and then I would go straight to the weekend preview section as soon as they were done with it, basically, so that I could read reviews of movies that I was definitely too young to see.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I just was curious about the stories. I wanted to know what was out there. I was curious about like the stuff that my parents were into, just because I was an only child, and so you're always kind of looking at your parents as like a
Sure.
model of what adults do, what adults like. And so yeah, they also both have been into movies as long as I've known them, which is my whole life. So it was not unusual for us to just like watch stuff that they loved, and that they would introduce to me, and we'd have really long conversations about them. It wasn't unusual for them to like be discussing art and movies with friends at like a dinner party,
Oh,
and
neat. Okay.
I would be there and I'd ask a question, and then all of a sudden I'm getting like the plot of Peter Weir's movie Picnic at Hanging Rock, when I'm like 8 years old at a dinner table from my mom, and she tells me like, yeah, it's a story about these girls that go on a school trip, and they go climbing up a mountain after this picnic, and then they disappear and they never come back, and nobody knows what happens to them. And she goes, and it's based on a true story. And I just am like, I'm 8, so just having that in the back of my brain, it's just like that's a thing I definitely want to like experience. So that's kind of where it started,
Okay.
and then yeah, kind of matured as I got older and kind of got more involved in church, along with my folks. I've been part of the church my whole life, and kind of trying to figure out where those things fit together, because
Yeah.
the conversations I had at home didn't always match the conversations that I had in like youth group, or things that I heard at church, or
Meaning
just
that like some films were more appreciated in your home than in the church?
yeah, yeah, either by virtue of like people just not having seen them, or
Okay.
it was, I mean, I came of age around the time of like Left Behind, and like
Okay.
arguments about whether or not Harry Potter was demonic. So like that was
Sure.
a thing that was just kind of part of the water we all swam in.
Yeah.
And I got very accustomed to kind of having to defend the stuff that I liked.
Okay.
um and to explain why it wasn't going to send me to hell, basically.
Did your parents have those conversations with you, kind of explaining their,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
don't know
I
why
mean,
they
they were
were.
very encouraging and very
Yeah.
open-minded about that stuff. But I was often surrounded by like friends and church leaders and teachers who didn't always agree with me, and
Okay.
I kind of had to have sort of a back and forth in my brain, and also with my parents, to kind of figure out what it is I really believe. Basically, it
Yeah.
was a really good early education in trying to figure out where I sat in like the continuum of faith.
Okay. Were there any particular movies, genres, directors, eras of film that kind of still hold a special place in your heart from growing up?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I one of the first movies I remember watching and just being completely blown away by was Terry Gilliam's movie Time Bandits, which
Okay.
yeah, came out in the 80s, I think. I want to say like early 80s, 82, 85. And I watched it with my cousins like years later on home video, like sitting on the carpet in their den eating like hot and now hamburgers and watching this movie, and just like getting my mind completely blown. Just because so much of it is shot from like a child's perspective, but it's
Okay.
dealing with very kind of fantastical views and very like philosophical and odd things that you would not expect from a children's film. And it just, yeah, I just really appreciated, even as a kid, that it was a movie that treated me as an adult,
Okay.
basically, that I was ready for like for certain things. And that kind of turned me into just basically a Terry Gilliam fan for a lot of my early adolescence. So like Brazil was a really formative movie for me.
Okay,
Yeah, a lot of stuff like that. My parents also really loved a movie that he directed but didn't write called The Fisher King that came out in the 90s. And so
sure.
that
Yeah.
was something that was around my house a lot as well.
Okay. And what about the critical piece? You kind of said that that was early on. Did your
Yeah.
parents kind of
Yeah.
was that did that come from them? Were they analyzing film and thinking about deeper kind of
Yeah, some
trajectories
of
and
it
stuff?
came. Yeah, some of it came from them. Some of it came from reading people who were writing film criticism and being
Oh
very
yeah, and
curious as
reading the
to,
newspaper and stuff.
yeah, like reading the
Okay.
newspaper. So like Michael Wilmington, Gene Siskel, Roger Ebert, like all of those
Okay.
folks, and just kind of taking that in and realizing that this was a thing that you could do, that you could
Yeah.
get paid for, um, which seemed like a great idea at the time. And then the older I got, realizing that like you can have opinions on things, but you need to be able to back them up.
Okay.
Like you need to be able to kind of establish some kind of authority on the topic. Like I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Here are other things that I can point to, and so that just kind of led me down a path of trying to be authoritative, like trying to learn and read and watch as much as I could,
Yeah.
so that I could actually have an educated opinion on why I felt the way I did about certain things. And then kind of by extension, often being not necessarily like angry at friends, but kind of disappointed and frustrated that not everybody saw stuff the same way that I did.
Sure. Yeah. Some
Um,
people were
but
okay to just be entertained, kind of.
yeah, yeah, and that's perfectly fine. But I think there's also kind of a missed opportunity there in that like it's not because I think as Christians we're often taught to be kind of discerning about what we take in,
Hmm.
right? And so I think where I've ended up landing is sort of a happy medium between the two, where I think it
Okay.
is important to be mindful of what it is that you're watching, that you're taking in, but not necessarily to a prescriptive exclusionary degree. I think
Okay.
it's just worth paying attention to what other people are thinking about, what they're talking about, and how they are thinking about and talking about and
Yeah.
expressing those things, and where our perspective fits in alongside theirs. And that's a thing that's not that hard to do. I think just people don't always necessarily have the tools built in to to start that conversation. But I think
Yeah.
once you kind of have the basics shared with, like, I think once I had learned the basics of how movies work, how they're put together, everything just kind of comes really naturally.
Okay.
And the critical thinking aspect just kind of bleeds over into every part of your life.
Was there, maybe it was the one you've already mentioned, but was there a specific film that kind of made you realize that movies could be more than just entertainment?
Oh gosh. That's a good question. I think, yeah, Time Bandits kind of helped me with that a little bit.
Okay.
What else was there? Oh man, I think I had a really interesting experience in college once, because I was taking a class that and this was sort of a revelatory moment for me. I was taking an anthropology class, and it was a class about um, like they called it the anthropology of violence. So it was
Okay.
countries that had kind of historical experiences of violence, whether that's like the Troubles in Ireland, or the Rwandan genocide, or uh, Algerian kind of colonization, and the fight between people from Algeria and the French colonizers. And so we ended up watching the Battle of Algiers in that class, as kind of an example, and sort of a visceral experience of like, this is what this time and place were like. And I remember really liking that movie. It's a really interesting exploration of I mean, having grown up like with the Iraq War on TV all the time, it's a really interesting approach to the idea of insurgent violence, and what causes that, and what makes people feel that desperate. And within the same 24 hours, I was watching Quentin Tarantino's Inglorious Bastards,
Okay.
which oddly enough, like uses some of the same, like it's all Ennio Morricone scores, and so one of the music cues is actually from the Battle of Algiers. So I could
Okay.
point that out and be like, I watched that earlier today.
Yeah.
Um, but because both of those movies are so violent, I had a really interesting kind of A and B example of here is what this looks like on screen. Here is what it's being used to convey in these two very different experiences, basically. Um, and while those things are different, and while some of the things that are being presented are maybe objectionable to some people, like I the fact that I disagree with something doesn't make it less worthy,
Sure.
basically. Um, and so it was kind of a revelatory moment, in that I realized that the same kind of storytelling device could be used in different ways to different ends, and that it was sort of impossible to kind of all or nothing just throw it away.
Yeah.
That it's worth engaging with on some level, and it's worth questioning why it's used this way in this movie and a different way in a different movie,
Yeah.
and what the end effect is.
How maybe shifting gears a little, and I know this is a probably a big loaded question, but how have you found your faith has shaped the way you approach film criticism and even
Yeah,
storytelling within that
it's
process?
yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of everything that we've kind of talked about so far. In that it makes me genuinely curious, basically,
Okay.
to see how other people interact with the world, what their perspective is, where they're coming from. um I go to a church that's really big on looking at the context of scripture, historically and culturally, and
Sure.
so that's, I mean, that's also a big thing of how I interact with basically all everything, every
Yeah.
form of media. And it's also, it's a thing that comes up in film criticism a lot, actually, is that when you're watching a movie that's made, either now or even more so historically, you're looking at the content of that movie through the lens of who was making it, where, and at what time.
Yeah. That's
So
something
like,
it's I want to hear you say more about this. I would just
yeah,
say that's something that like I feel, and probably general moviegoers do not think much about, but I see
sure,
how that, the rules from the biblical text, and just literature in general should be applied in the same way. But I never think about like where was the person that made this movie and what was
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah,
era. And, but
yeah,
so please continue.
for
Sorry for
sure.
interrupting you.
So like, one really good example of this is, there's a Hollywood history podcast called You Must Remember This, that's hosted by Karina Longworth, and
Okay.
she's a really great film historian. And the way that she talks about, specifically like the studio system up through like the 50s, and then into like how that changed in like the 60s and 70s and 80s, it really gives you a different perspective on why certain movies are the way that they are.
Okay.
So like a movie that's shot in like 1945 on like the MGM lot is going to be working from a different playbook entirely than a movie that was shot in like the 1970s, when the studio system was falling apart and they were hiring new, young, untried directors because Hollywood studios wanted to make money any way they could, and they couldn't figure out how. And so they just like basically threw projects at people and said, "You have an idea, here, go make a thing." And so that's why you
Interesting.
have movies like Easy Rider and Jaws, and like all this stuff that came out from like kind of the Hollywood movie brats group, is just like people were trying things because they didn't know what worked.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so now one of the reasons that we have like so many Marvel movies and like big kind of tentpole IP driven films is
Hmm.
because like that's proven over the last few years to make money, and so studios are now at the point where they're like, that's what people want. And so when those movies start to perform maybe less well, or certain forms of them perform less well, they start to get panicky and wonder like, that format isn't working anymore, what do we do next? And so it's, I think, like right now we're in kind of an interesting spot where I think it's going to potentially, hopefully, lead to some really interesting swings,
Okay.
that may not be for a while, but I'd love to see that when they happen.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's, if people who are, I don't know, like my super film nerd friends and I, like, this is what we talk about all the time. Like, we are always paying attention to, basically what the filmmakers that we love were thinking about at various times in their career, and kind of seeing that evolve over time can be a really fun and fascinating project.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like I don't know what it is. Maybe just we think about you don't see the humans behind the movies to think
Sure.
that like
Yeah.
the movie, but like we would think about in literature, I think especially is like that it's coming out of a real person. It's an expression
Yeah.
of something rather than just made in a lab kind of
Yeah.
thing.
I think the best thing that I can kind of compare it to is like when you're going to an art museum and you're looking at paintings.
Yeah.
So like if you're looking at an exhibit of, say, like Jackson Pollock paintings, you're going to see how the paintings he was making at the beginning of his career are like vastly different than the ones that he was making at the middle, and those are vastly different than the ones he was making at the end. And those are just based on maybe movements in art. They're based on kind of where the market was headed. They're also based on what he was thinking and feeling and the people that were around him and how they were influencing him. And you can even just go into a move or you can go into a gallery of like impressionists and you can see how this person working in France differs from this person working in the United States, differs from this person working in I don't know, a different part of the world.
Mhm.
And they're all kind of working from the same form of interests, but the results are different. And so like I think it's the same with film. It's sold to us as a commercial product, and I mean that's
Yeah.
not completely wrong. Like that's how that stuff gets paid for and made. But the base level of it, I think, is always coming from people who are interested in art and who are interested in telling stories, and those stories usually come from some kind of base personal interest or truth, which is
Mhm.
kind of where my own interest in faith comes in. Because for me, at least, a lot of those broad themes tend to kind of meld together with the stuff that we talk about in church, because
Yeah.
it's all kind of trying to figure out the answers to some of the same questions.
On that note, before we even get to the book, are there films that have deepened your own spiritual reflection or faith that I'm guessing are probably not a part of the Christian film industry?
Oh yeah, yeah. A lot of them are actually in this book. This was a great opportunity for me to kind of like point at the specifics of movies that I really love and go,
Yeah.
hey, this is important to me.
Okay.
Um, I'm trying to think if there are other ones outside of that that really.
Yeah. Was there a
Uh,
short list for this book, like films that you
oh yeah, I
wanted
mean
to keep
it's
in that
yeah
you cut out?
it's so the book is based on kind of an article series that I did for a website called Think Christian, and
Okay.
so a lot of these were movies that had copied over from that experience, and a lot of those movies were in that article list because they were ones that I'd been thinking about for a
Okay.
really long time. But there are other ones too. Like Babette's Feast is one that I think gets brought up a lot
Okay.
by like Christians basically of like my parents' generation and into mine because our parents were watching it. That kind of means a lot to me. And there's a movie that actually came out this last year called The Taste of Things that reminded me quite a bit of Babette's
Okay.
Feast in that regard. And gosh, what else? The Lord of the Rings movies, obviously. I mean, it's got like the Tolkien connection, and that also has kind of a basis in faith since he was a Catholic, and that's part of it. But that was kind of a formative experience for
Okay.
me. Was kind of watching those movies and realizing that some of the emotions that I felt while I was watching them were not that different from emotions I felt during certain times when I was in church.
And Lion and the Witch in the Wardrobe, I think that made it into the book,
Oh yeah,
right?
for
And that
sure.
was
Yeah,
that was a
yeah, yeah.
formative one for
Um,
you.
yeah, that was. I mean, I'd grown up reading those books,
Okay.
obviously, and I remember really enjoying the adaptation of like that first adaptation when it came out in theaters, and then getting to revisit that again for the book was a lot of fun because there were things that I picked up on at this time that I really appreciated that
Okay.
I hadn't noticed as much the first time around.
Well, could you give just a general thesis of the book and maybe
Yeah,
talk a little again, you already mentioned it, I think, but what sparked this idea for films for all seasons, or what sparked the series of articles even
yeah.
that kind of came before this?
So the book is a collection of essays that's sort of a guide for movies to watch during the church liturgical calendar. And I know that's kind of a big set of words. Like not every church is as into the calendar as other churches, but basically the church calendar is just all of the major holidays that we celebrate in church, as well as some minor ones that it's not Christmas or Easter, but like Pentecost, where we celebrate the technically like the birth of the church and the
Mhm.
early Christian movement, or All Saints Day and All Souls Day, where we kind of celebrate the history of the church and significant people in church history and also in our own lives that have kind of shaped us spiritually. And so all of this, it starts with Advent, it ends with All Saints and All Souls Day. And it's kind of this great big circle that takes you through basically the narrative of the Gospels. It starts with Advent, with the birth of Christ, and then it kind of ends sort of beautifully with us recognizing sort of the legacy of where we've been and where we're headed. And I think it's really kind of fun to, as a person who really enjoys story structure, that I feel like the structure of the church year really is almost literary in its
Yeah,
structure, and
sure.
that like it kind of introduces you to these themes and these characters that are going to kind of fade in and fade out over time. They're going to take us different places. We're going to think about different things, but those ideas are all just going to kind of be present there through everybody that we're going to meet. And so the article series that this is based on started in 2020 as part of lockdown. um,
Okay.
so as I'm sure you and your listeners are aware, churches were mainly closed and doing services online, and so people weren't able to gather and worship together in person. And my editor at the site, Josh Larson, who's also a great writer on film, he's the co-host of the Film Spotting podcast. He suggested that it would be a cool idea to put together a list of movies for, I think it was Holy Week at the time,
Okay.
uh, that people could watch at home with their families, or like maybe have viewing parties online, because like Netflix parties were really big at the time, to talk about with friends. So I put that together, and that became so popular that, or it did really well. It did good traffic for the site, and so I got invited to do more and more. And then by the time that I had gotten through the majority of the church year, I realized I had an outline.
Okay. Nice.
Which is, I mean, it's the hardest part of pitching a book, is
For
figuring out
sure.
like not just what you're going to write about, but how you're going to write about it.
Hmm.
And so I had this form just kind of neatly plopped into my lap, and so from then on, it was just kind of a nice little skeleton to build stuff off of. And Josh was also immensely helpful and supportive in kind of helping me get that off the ground. So
Okay.
big thanks
Awesome.
to him.
Do you any like kind of personal connection to the seasons that you have that influenced your desire to tie them to movies?
Um, yeah, it was funny when Josh introduced the idea of doing the series. It was like it was something that I think still kind of lived in the back of my brain, and I hadn't even really considered it
Okay.
until then. I think back when the Star Wars movie The Last Jedi came out, which is in the book for Advent, I did actually write about it for Sojourners at the time as an Advent movie, because it felt very much like a film that was about kind of hopefully doing without, in the
Okay.
words of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and waiting and trying to live with the concept of hope, and realizing that hope is both an active thing and something that requires patience and trust and an understanding that you are not the entirety of the plan. Um, which are all things that show up in that movie. And so I think somebody actually put in the comments of that article that if The Last Jedi is an Advent movie, then Rogue One is a Good Friday movie. And I remember at the time thinking, oh my
Interesting.
gosh, you're right. um, because that movie is so like just it. And actually that movie's in this book too for Good Friday, because it's such a good match, I think, emotionally.
Yeah.
Like you have characters that have literally sacrificed themselves for the greater good, and that's a greater good that they are not going to see, but we as viewers know that it exists, because without this event there is no rest of the story. And that's exactly what Good Friday is, which is, it's such an interesting thing to kind of map onto it. And I know that's not intentional necessarily by the filmmakers means, it's just like it's such a um it's like a larger truth that kind of bleeds over, where you
Sure.
just like see connections in these things and go, oh, okay.
Yeah.
And yeah, even as a kid, I remember like being at a Good Friday service, or maybe Monday Thursday service at church, and kind of latching onto like sort of the feelings of uncertainty and tragedy and betrayal that are part of that. When you're talking about like the Last Supper, and Jesus getting arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, and his disciples trying to fight the Roman soldiers, and one of them, I think Peter, cuts off somebody's ear, and then Jesus heals that ear and is like, no, this has to happen, I have to go with them. And it's a really complex thing, and it kind of goes against what we understand, like how we understand a story is supposed to go.
Yeah.
Especially one that has like a hero in it, like Jesus. Like Jesus is supposed to be, he has all this power, he can fight back, he can do this, that, the other. And as a kid, that was something that I remember kind of struggling with, and not really being able to wrap my brain around. It was just like sort of this hard, sad thing, and I couldn't understand why it had to be that way.
Hmm.
And I think it was like maybe 13 when I had this realization that, because the Lord of the Rings movies were big, that was how I felt watching the end of the Fellowship of the Ring, because it ends similarly too. Like all of these things are happening, and we as the audience know that this is only the first part of a trilogy, and
Hmm.
the story is going to continue, but the characters don't know that, and they're ending this particular like entry in the story in a really uncertain place. Like some of their party have died, some of their party have been kidnapped. They're all kind of split, and they're going off in different directions, and this is like it's not the way that this quest was supposed to go.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing them at a point that feels like failure, but we know is is necessary and that is going to continue in a way that will ultimately be victorious. We just haven't seen that part yet.
How do you think the changing of seasons affects our emotional connections to movies?
It's like uh
Like,
so like
why is
from a
that
natural
a
oh
thing?
sorry
I guess.
yeah, why is that a thing? It's a good
Yeah.
question. Like I think from like a natural perspective, like I am definitely more drawn to certain genres during certain times of the
Hmm.
year. I mean, like Halloween, obviously I love horror movies, but
Okay.
like when it comes to like Christmas, when it comes to Advent, I usually want stuff that is like maybe more high fantasy, more high concept,
Okay.
something that's a little bit escapist, maybe because like it's cold and it's getting dark sooner and like the weather is kind of gross, and also like the cultural celebration of Christmas is itself kind of full of that iconography, like a lot of warm colors and like Santa and the idea of kind of childhood and innocence and magic.
Hmm.
But I think also like I think Advent is kind of tied into that too, where it's about finding light in the darkness and it's about finding hope in a space that does not look super hopeful. And that's also kind of, I think, wintry in nature. Like that's something that really goes along with the fact that it's kind of dark and cold and
Yeah.
we want to be close to the people that we love and care about. I think I always see spring as a really transitional time,
Okay.
which in itself can be kind of dramatic, and it draws me toward movies that are also a little bit more dramatic in that regard. Just I mean, it's a hopeful kind of drama, and that like we're looking towards something changing. Like in the sense of Easter, we're looking for the resurrection of Jesus. In the sense of nature, we're looking for the temperatures to get a little bit warmer for the flowers to come up, and I think those things kind of they all go together. What else? I think All Saints Day and All Souls Day, the fact that they fall after like between Halloween and Thanksgiving, like you're starting to think about family, you're starting to think about maybe the people who aren't with you this year who were last year,
Hmm.
or maybe you're thinking about, I don't know, getting out like a legacy recipe from your family that's generations old and you're thinking about the people that made that. Um, so I think a lot of these seasons just kind of naturally lend themselves to they lend themselves to certain kinds of stories, and those
Yeah.
stories kind of lend themselves to like, I don't know, the way that you might crave like Mexican food certain days of the week. Like that's kind of the way that it works for me.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I mean, Halloween and Christmas. I mean, those ones are obvious ones, but I've never thought too much about like, say like this new Bob Dylan kind of biopic,
Oh, uh-huh.
A Complete Unknown. Like, is
Yes.
there a better season to for audiences to engage to release a biopic, or like you say in the
Right.
spring, like is there a better time to release kind of a dramatic movie, or I don't know,
Yeah.
for why is
And
summer like cater to comedies or
right. I
interesting
think
ties to seasons?
yeah. And that I think has more to do with kind of the business of Hollywood.
Yeah,
In that
yeah. You
like near
think
the
they've
end
kind
of
of
the
trained us
year,
for that a little?
I think they did a bit, yeah. So like a lot of big budget prestige movies tend to come out like between November and December and into January
Okay.
because like award season is around the corner and they want that to be kind
Oh,
of fresh
sure.
in your brain and not
Yep.
forget about that stuff. Blockbusters tend to come out in the summer, I think, because kids are out of school and they're looking for something to do, and
Yep.
like
That
what's
made
more
sense.
attractive than a big theater with air conditioning and like giant explosions on screen.
Yeah.
So like all of that kind of goes together, but I think it also it kind of creates like a weird Pavlovian response, in that like I don't know,
Yeah.
in the summer I really feel like I mean Die Hard came out in July. Die Hard came out the week I was born, funnily
Oh,
enough. But it's
interesting.
still
Okay.
like it's technically a Christmas movie because it takes
Yeah.
place at Christmas. And so a lot of people view it that way. And I
Yeah.
tend to as well, to the point where I'm like, I'm not really sure why this would have done well in July. Like I get
Sure.
it in
Yeah.
theory, but it hasn't really worked that way. But like when summer hits, usually I'm really in the mood for like Die Hard 3 because that's a great summer in the city movie where
Yeah.
it's like really hot temperatures. It's like in the middle of New York. And as a kid who grew up in a big city, like I have very fond memories of, summertime in downtown Chicago with tall buildings around and lots of big
Okay.
open parks and people running around. So it's, yeah, I think it just kind of, it kind of goes with us naturally, whether we expect it to or not.
I remember when Anchorman. There's not too many movies I remember when they were released, but I remember seeing Anchorman in the summer, like it came out whatever summer, 2000, whatever. And it's just,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, whether it's Pavlonian or not, like every summer I'm kind of like ready for a comedy.
Yeah. Oh,
And
for
maybe,
sure.
yeah, I don't,
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it does kind of depend. Like, I think we talk about like rom-coms around this time of year, maybe because Valentine's Day isn't that far away.
Hmm.
But I think those are also like those are a cozy genre. Like
Yeah,
that's a genre that I associate with like curling up on the couch with like a quilt and a glass of wine, because like that's it's gonna make me feel good. It's gonna make me
sure.
feel a certain way.
Yeah,
Yeah, like the Adam McKay movies like Anchorman and like Talladega Nights. Those are great summer movies because they're
yeah,
really raucous and loud and fun, and
yeah,
like they're great to watch with a crowd. And that's kind of, maybe people are off from like school or work, or like their schedules are a little bit different, and like they have
yeah.
that time to kind of go and hang out in the theater together.
Where it would feel a little, again, maybe pre-programmed, but it feel a little wrong for me to like go see Anchorman in like December or
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
February. I don't know,
Yeah. No, I
for some
totally get
reason.
that. Yeah. 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 It's, and what's really weird is that, like, I don't know, the person sitting next to you might have a totally different opinion or
Sure. Yeah.
feeling.
Yeah.
And that's completely valid. I just think that's really interesting that our own personal rhythms are just kind of defined by a lot of times by our own experiences, which
Yeah.
is,
And I suppose
yeah.
music, and I don't read a lot of fiction, but I imagine it would have the
Hmm.
same effect. But definitely music seems to have
Yeah.
that too, right? It's like this
Yeah.
feels
Yeah.
seasonal or it
For
fits into the
sure.
right.
Yeah, like jazz is for fall and winter.
Yeah.
I don't know, like synth pop for me. Like I really like listening to kind of like cyberpunky synth pop around this time
Okay.
of year when it's sort of dark and gloomy. Like it
Yeah.
just, yeah, it just depends.
Were there any films that surprised you during the research of the or writing process for this book or for the articles?
Hmm.
I don't know,
Um,
any outliers that
that's a good question. I think I um there were a few, especially like in the appendix, because
okay.
that's like sort of just that came at the end of the writing process, and I was
Okay.
trying to think of more stuff that I hadn't really already written about. And a lot of the shorter entries in that section of the book came from conversations that sort of popped up while I was writing it.
Okay.
So the documentary in there for Sama was something that came as a result of a Think Christian podcast. Like, I would not have watched that movie if I had not been asked to for for the show, and I'm really glad that I did. It's an amazing film. I think thinking about Epiphany movies was a little bit hard for me because I was trying to think, like, I had written one essay at the time for that, which was Shazam, and so I needed to expand that chapter, and I was trying to think of another one, and I ended up writing sort of the appendix entries for that first to see if there was anything in there that I really felt like I could sink my teeth into. And then Barbie just kind of popped up, fully formed in my head, kind of epiphany style,
Okay.
honestly. And I was so excited about it that, like, I have a group of friends who are also writers on Faith and Film. We kind of have like a text group going, and I sent that suggestion to them, and I was like, you guys, is this anything? I think this might be something. And so for like the next 15 minutes we were texting back and forth and being like, yes, this works, and this works, and this works, and this works. This is a great idea. I can't wait to see what you do with it. And
Oh,
it
that's
was,
awesome.
yeah, it was really cool. It was that one was a really fun one to write.
Were there any films that were particularly difficult to categorize into a specific season,
Mm.
but still, I don't know,
Yeah.
felt important to include?
Yeah. So The Night of the Hunter is one that it's like it's my favorite movie of all time, and
Okay.
it's a movie from 1952, directed by Charles Lawton, a black and white film, and it's one that can fit a lot of different categories depending on what you need it to fit.
Okay.
So ultimately, it's a really interesting kind of dialogue between two forms of Christian faith. There's like the form that unfortunately I think a lot of mainstream culture is used to, which is one that's very judgmental and hypocritical and at sometimes violent,
Okay.
versus one that is very nurturing and knowledgeable and humble and not brash and often not noticed by people. And so that's like kind of the core dialogue of it. And initially I had that slotted for I think All Souls Day, because it's such a really good example of what a formative person in your faith journey can be. Um, and then the way that the book was restructured when it went through editing, I ended up using it for Christmas, because it is, I mean, it does end at Christmas, so it has that element of it. But there are other parts too that I think are essential to considering parts of the Christmas story, like the kind of the vulnerability of Jesus as a baby and the Holy Family and the flight to Egypt and kind of um what that required of them, basically, that we don't always talk about in detail. And I think thematically, some of those ideas are also in the movie. And so that it kind of took a little bit of mental gymnastics for me to kind of shift it from one thing to another thing.
Sure.
But I do think it worked. I hope it worked. I think it worked for me.
Yeah, it worked for me. I mean, I
Great.
got to admit, the majority of movies in here, this book was a primer to be like, oh man,
Good.
you need to go watch this movie. So I'm kind of
Good. Yeah.
backtracking where like I read the book and now I'm gonna go view uh more and more of the movies. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's I was hoping it would be kind of a balance between titles that people were a little more familiar with and could kind of revisit in a new
Yeah.
way, and stuff that people either knew about and hadn't seen, or were completely unfamiliar with and had the opportunity to kind of dig in and explore, because those are the books that I that's the kind of writing that I like the most, is stuff that I can actually come away with it with like a takeaway that I want to follow
Yeah.
up on.
I think you did a good job of this. Like, there's such a, whether it was intentional or not, a pretty wide variation of movies to where you can find something that you've watched and then find things that kind of invite you to watch. Uh, I feel like that kept me reading too, to be like, oh no, I'm like Line in the Wardrobe or Witch in the Wardrobe's coming up or
Yeah.
whatever it is. I would have, this is not a criticism of the book. I would have loved to see like A River Runs Through It or
Mm,
Almost Famous or some, I
yeah.
mean, the just like you opened my brain up to kind of think like, oh, what movies could, not that I'm in no way a film critic, but I'm like,
Oh no,
yeah,
yeah.
what other movies should like fit into these categories?
Yeah,
It
can
was,
I turn that back around on you?
yeah,
Are there
please.
are there movies that have kind of been formative for you that you either have thought about in that way before or started thinking about in that way?
Yeah, not that I've thought about in this way, like calendar wise,
Sure. Yeah.
uh, but like
But even just like spiritually.
yeah, I a river runs through it. I feel like I have a very spiritual connection to. That's felt like
Hmm.
a formative movie for me. Have you seen
I
that?
have. It's been a long time, but yeah,
Okay.
tell me more about what
Yeah,
makes
it's
that
just, I mean,
stick out
even
for
the
you.
basic thing that like the dad's a pastor. They're like,
Hmm.
some relation there. That fly fishing just is this like I had just the cinematography of the movie, I think, is beautiful. The soundtrack with it, like it just everyone watches that movie and then wants to fly fish because like it
Hmm.
just feels like this experience that you get invited into. I was already fly fishing, so then as a fly fisherman, that's like is like,
Oh
oh,
yeah.
they made a movie about fly fishing. So then that also has a take, and then it's just a kind of a prodigal son story that ends
Yeah.
in a very sad way, but like
Yeah.
you know Brad Pitt's character and the older brother too that's struggling in his own ways. Yeah, I
Yeah.
don't know.
Is
I
fly
couldn't
fishing as meditative for you as it is for them?
for sure. Yeah, there's an old Wendell Berry
I've always been curious
poem
about
called
that.
like The Contrariness of the Mad Farmer, and he talks
Hmm.
about he's like they say God is dead and I say no, he goes fishing with me every day on the Kentucky River. I see him
That's cool.
often. And like that
Yeah.
kind of yeah, that fly fishing's like so isolated and on a river and
Yeah.
so to see that depicted and that sense of it like kind of was still portrayed in the movie. I don't know.
Yeah.
Just and then Almost Famous, I don't know why, just that's a favorite movie. It just feels like, I can't relate to Cameron Crowe in the experience, but
Hmm.
just just kind of a story of I don't know, growing up and
Yeah.
adolescence, going out and
Yeah.
seeing feeling the world, experiencing like things you weren't supposed to experience,
Yeah.
I
I
don't
wonder
know,
if there's maybe a little bit of like Proverbs
coming
and
of age.
Ecclesiastes in there, of like somebody who's gone out and experienced the world and has kind of come back with a certain
Yeah,
amount
that's
of
a good
wisdom that they
point.
want to share with you.
Yeah, because at the end, all he wants to do is be home,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Be in his
Yeah.
room, be on his
Exactly.
pillow, and
Yeah. 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 And like,
kind of
I don't know,
over the rest of it.
some of the things that like his overprotective mother who like freaks everybody
Yeah,
out a little bit, Frances
yeah,
McDormand, how she is like she's kind of right about some things. Like he
sure,
has to kind
yep,
of learn that on his own though. And like his
yeah,
sister is also right about some things. And
hmm
Lester Bangs is also right about some things, and
yeah,
nobody's right about everything.
yeah,
So yeah, I think that's such an interesting observation. I like that a lot.
yeah. Lester Baines is a wonderful character
Yeah, he
in
is.
that movie.
Yeah.
but yeah, this was I don't know, Abby, I don't read a lot of film criticism, but I felt like this book too is inviting just to read more of what you've written
Thanks
and
you.
just other people because I just watch movies so often for entertainment and they're almost disposable. But
Hmm.
to be reminded to think about movies again in the same way or already think about like books and scripture and whatever to be like, I think we already maybe touched on this, but yeah, it's not just, it didn't just come out of a machine. Like this is an actual
Yeah. Yeah.
expression with layers and like,
And there are a number of critics. I think part of the issue is that I didn't grow up with a lot of great Christian film criticism. I think a lot
yeah.
of the and a lot of other folks I think around my age who have gone into film criticism and do it from a faith-based angle would probably tell you something similar. That we grew up with a lot of kind of prescriptive stuff of like
Okay.
watch this, don't watch this, and the stuff that
Hmm.
they encouraged you to watch was often stuff that had been produced by Christians. And that's, I mean, that's not necessarily a knock against it. It just is kind of limiting. Like you're
Yeah.
not kind of getting the full flavor of what's out there and like getting you're getting reinforced, not challenged.
Hmm.
And that I think was a struggle for a lot of us, especially for those of us who like liked watching mainstream movies and felt like we weren't being given permission to. Um, but I think that's changed a lot because a lot of us grew up and we were frustrated by it and wanted to make our own stuff. I have friends that have written all kinds of stuff. Like my friend Sarah Welch Larson wrote a really fascinating book on the Alien franchise and
Oh, interesting.
yeah, the idea of creation theology and the Alien franchise, which is just I can't recommend it enough. It's called Becoming Alien.
Okay.
Um, and Josh Larson, my editor, has written a couple of different books. One for InterVarsity Press called Movies Are Prayers, and one called Fear Not, that's specifically about horror movies.
Oh, I would love to.
And it's yeah,
Is
they're
that
all
a
great.
recent book?
Yes, Fear Not, I think came out last year, or
Okay.
sorry, the year before last. It was a 2023 book.
Might
We're still
see if
in yeah.
InterVarsity can connect me to
Oh, for sure.
Josh for
Yeah. 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 And
that.
Alyssa Wilkinson, who is now a film critic at the New York Times,
Okay.
she has done a lot of great writing about. She also used to be the film editor at Christianity Today, and so
Okay.
she's got a really interesting perspective on both faith-based, like faith-based faith-based criticism and mainstream art, kind of the marriage of those two things in a way that I really respect. So I think we haven't always been given the best primer for how to interact with
Yeah.
mainstream culture. I think, but the it's I think it is out there, and the more stuff that you try to kind of actively and curiously engage with, I think the more that you'll find.
Can you tell me? I'm not going to put this on you to try and, get you in hot water for saying
No,
something,
no.
but I'll say it and you tell me if you think I'm way off. Is the thing that makes Christian movies often kind of cheesy, possibly that they're recreating even more than the secular world, recreating a world that doesn't actually exist? Like,
Oh,
I've wondered sometimes if like, because there's a cheesiness that seems to over, I don't know, be in a
yeah,
lot of them, or definitely in the era I grew up in.
yeah,
And I've wondered sometimes, like, when you remove, like, say, all cursing from a movie, I'm like, yeah, that's nice, but I also don't live in a world where
mm-hmm,
there is no cursing and everyone talks like Leave It to Beaver. So then
yeah.
all right off the bat, then there's like kind of, even though it's a Christian movie, it's like, yeah, but it's a little separated because it's not a world I understand. Like they so almost sanitize it that
Yeah,
it
I think
becomes, but I don't know how you do that, make it with, get away from that. But does that make any
yeah, no,
sense?
I no, I agree. I think yeah, I think you're coming at it from a really good beginning perspective. And that sounds reductive. I don't mean it to. That's a great place to start, is what I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
conversation wise.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So some of it I think is that like not all Christian like not all Christian movies are made by Christian people. Some of them, kind of like Hallmark movies, are made for an audience that a studio
Okay.
believes is going to want to see and
Oh,
expect
that's a
certain
good point.
things.
Yeah.
And so it kind of weakens their ability to, I think, to be good ministry tools from that perspective, because it's really just preaching to the choir and it's not really saying anything that's gonna, I mean, unless movies speak to different people in different ways. So it's I don't want to
Mhm.
make too many blanket statements,
For
but
sure.
I
Yeah.
think they're probably not going to reach somebody who maybe has been hurt by that kind of theology before. They're gonna look at it and see certain things that they find objectionable or harmful
Mhm.
or not true to the way that they live their life. I know that's been the case for me and for other people, other peers of mine.
Okay.
I think Alyssa has actually written a lot about kind of the lack of prophetic imagination in a lot of Christian movies.
Okay. Yeah.
That like that the Bible offers so much possibility for what we can do. Like there's all kinds of stuff in there. Like nothing is off limits.
Yeah.
And so the fact that that Christian movies and Christian produced films um tend to only operate within a very restrictive set of kinds of stories you can tell
Yeah.
is further disappointing. Like it's really limiting. um I have seen that start to change a little bit. I saw the movie Cabrini about Francesca Cabrini that came out last year, and I was actually pretty impressed with it. It's a well made film. I think some of that comes with some of those studios having more money to work with.
Okay.
So there's that. Um, but also like it was a really complexly and intelligently written movie in a way that I had not really seen from a lot of Christian produced films up to that point. So I think things are starting to change in some interesting ways. I think we have kind of a long way to go. I think it's important to kind of try to make stuff for people that meets them where they're at,
Hmm.
and in kind of a broader sense, not necessarily to water down a message, but to recognize that not everybody is going to be on board with your message right from
Yeah.
the jump. And I think that's something that a lot of contemporary films tend to do really well, is to kind of put the story first and then see how you can kind of map the themes onto the story rather than the other way around, where you have like this message that you want to make sure that you
Hmm.
hammer into people's heads. Like even mainstream films that do that, I think they tend to be less successful than movies that see story as kind of the tool itself.
Yeah. You mentioned imagination, and I often think
Mm-hmm.
of that too, being like, do we struggle with imagination as Christians? Like, and maybe, or like in one direction, like maybe we don't struggle
Mm-hmm.
with, as a viewer, with the imagination if I'm watching a secular movie, but when I watch a Christian movie or, has some kind of Christian background or directors or something,
Mm-hmm.
just like in Christian literature, I all of a sudden lose my ability to kind of escape into an imaginary world because all of a sudden I
Sure.
have to like make sure this all lines up biblically. Like it becomes a
Yeah.
very like have nothing. I'm not saying anything about the Shack one way or another, but like I remember when that book came out and the Christian
Yeah.
world blew up, and at least a part of me was like, isn't it like isn't it just a he's just given and I don't know a picture
Yeah.
that he
Yeah.
had, do we have no ability to imagine that and like
Sure.
give
It's
it
like,
some
yeah, like an
license if it
illustrated TED
doesn't
talk.
line
Yeah.
up with every part of Matthew's gospel or whatever?
Yeah.
Like, do you think Christians to some degree struggle with the
I think
imagination
do. I think
piece?
I think it depends on the Christian, but
Sure. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think also it depends on who's being loud, and that is I think part of it too. There are like a lot of Harry Powells out there to bring it back to Night of the Hunter, um, and so I think there is that, and um filmmakers, maybe not even necessarily filmmakers, but the people who give the filmmakers money tend to
Mhm.
listen to the loudest voices in the room because they
Okay.
are trying to make stuff that is going to make money. And if people are complaining loudly about a certain thing, it doesn't even necessarily matter whether those concerns are valid. They're
Yeah.
going to
Yeah.
pay attention to them. And so sometimes that can lead to bad art. I think there are people out there who are like there are Christian filmmakers who work in mainstream spaces, who are doing really interesting work. Like Scott Derrickson is probably maybe the highest profile one I can think of
Okay.
off the top of my head. And he works primarily in horror movies. So like he made The Exorcism of Emily Rose, Sinister.
And he's a
Um,
Christian director.
yeah, yeah,
Oh,
yeah, yeah,
that's
yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah, he made The Black Phone that came out like a year and a half ago.
Yeah, was that Johnny Depp?
And yeah, um,
Or no, that was a
Ethan
different one.
Hawke. Yeah,
Ethan Hawke, yeah, with the
yeah,
real
yeah, yeah.
crazy face on the
Yes, yeah, with
front.
the big
Okay.
mask. Yeah, yeah. And that it's really interesting to listen to him talk about that in interviews because that parts of that movie have kind of parallels to what his own growing up experience was
Okay.
in like I think in Colorado around the same time. Even though it's based on um not a Stephen King story, it's his son, Joe Hill. It's based on a Joe Hill short
Okay.
story. So Yeah, but it's always really interesting to kind of hear his interpretation of that stuff because he's very aware of the fact that like he had a difficult upbringing, and so he knows that darkness exists. He's experienced it firsthand, and he's interested in kind of exploring those themes with the knowledge that that's not all there is. And so I think it's really interesting to watch somebody who's willing to go that hard and that dark,
Hmm.
while also fully believing that there are kind of forces beyond our control and beyond our knowledge, both that work both for good and for ill.
Yeah.
So yeah, just people like that who come up every once in a while, and it's
Oh,
you're
that's
really
interesting.
impressed and surprised by them.
Hmm.
Like I would love to interview Drew Goddard at some point and know what his faith background is, just because the stuff that shows up in Bad Times at the El Royale to me feels so faith based.
Yeah.
Like it feels very Christiany to me, and so I would be really curious to kind of know what, if anything, is influenced by that, because the
Hmm.
ideas of grace and forgiveness in that movie and the way that they're expressed is so close to the way that I feel about that stuff too. So it's, yeah, it's always interesting to kind of to dig in and think about that stuff.
How do you see churches using films for all seasons to foster discussions about faith
Yeah.
and culture and just films and
Um,
movies in general?
yeah, I think I've had some churches, including my own. We've done some movie nights with kind of discussion questions after the fact. I did a talk at one church where they were planning on going through the Advent chapter like week by
Oh,
week,
neat.
and like they would,
Okay.
yeah, like they read it on their own as like a small group, and then got together and watched the movie, and then would discuss it. So like that's an option too. I think it's also just, if like, one of the reasons I was so excited to partner with InterVarsity Press on this is because they have the connection to InterVarsity as a, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. And there are a lot of people who are leading groups of young adults who are probably interested in movies and popular culture, and this is a way to maybe start that conversation. if
Hmm.
you're if you're looking to like try and do movie nights at your church, this is one way to kind of um, get some, discussion questions, get some ideas for movies to watch, and get some ideas about maybe the way to couch that conversation if you're just kind of trying to get started and figure out
Hmm.
how to approach it. So yeah, there's lots of different ways to dig in. I've had friends who've read it straight through. I've had friends who are wanting to kind of read it bit by bit alongside the calendar and kind of treat it as a companion, which I think is really lovely, and it kind of warms my heart when people do
Yeah,
that.
I bet. Why do you think it's important for Christians to engage with culture through the lens of film, especially maybe even as seasons change related to your
Sure.
book?
Yeah. I think in one way it's a really accessible way to do that,
Okay,
because like if you're reading a book that might take you several days or weeks depending on how fast a reader you are. um if you're going to like, if visual art is great, but maybe not everybody has access to a museum where they can see that stuff in person.
sure.
Movies are widely accessible, like you can get them from your library, you can go see them in a theater, you can stream them. This is, and it's, stuff that mostly will only take up like 2 to 3 hours of your time, maybe a little bit more in some spots. um so it's a very easy way to kind of quickly get hold of ideas that other people are talking about, especially if they're really popular movies. These are things that are probably already in the lexicon. Like, a lot of people have seen a lot of Marvel movies, and so they have ideas about why they like certain characters and certain moments that have spoken to them. um Other people, I don't know, have seen a lot of Star Wars movies, and they have really strong opinions about those. So like, these are ways to kind of engage very quickly with people who you might not otherwise know how to start that conversation with. um so that's one aspect of it. I think another is that it's just important as Christians to know the many different ways that the things that we care about and the ideas that we think about all the time, the ways that those can be expressed. I think sometimes we grow up with a really limiting understanding of what that can look like. We talked, about all of the like Christian produced films and how those sometimes fail to do that because they're
Hmm.
they're kind of working within a limiting worldview. Um, and I think the more that you watch, the more you have the opportunity to think about the way that other people see the world and the way that other people think about things, which can be, I think, really eye-opening, both like culturally, artistically. It can help you understand people whose lives are really different from yours. I've had experiences where I watched like a documentary about trans sex workers living in New York's meatpacking district in the 80s and their struggles together, with a friend and his mom, who I know is more conservative than either of us, but a really sweet and loving woman. And after the fact, she was, emotional about it, and we all were. And I asked her how she felt about the movie because I was genuinely curious. I didn't know which way she was going to go, and she said that was really hard to watch, and that nobody should have to live like that. And I was like, "You're right. That's it. Message received." So it opens you up to things like that where you may not think about certain communities, just because they're not around you, and being able to see what other people go through, I think, is a good way to understand how we're needed in the world and how we can help.
That's an excellent answer. That's gives me
It was
a
kind of
lot to
rambly,
think
but
about.
I think for me it leaks into every part of how I live
Yeah.
my life and everything I think about.
Yeah, film. I would love to talk to you for hours because I just film's so fascinating as a I think as Christians, as people who are supposed to uh, not be highly critical of culture, but be able to critique culture, be able to understand
Exactly.
it, see
Yeah.
the deeper layers to it. And film just seems like such a all the big messages of our culture are portrayed through film, and all the small ones too, probably.
Yeah, it's a good starting point to, I think, to all forms of media literacy, basically, just to critical thinking and to strengthening that muscle. It leads you to like ask even just basic questions of like, why did they put that there, or like, why did this person choose to make the story do this thing? Um, and when you start asking those questions and you start asking them enough, I have found, at least in my own experience, that I start asking those questions of like everything. Um, Whether that's food I eat, or news that I see, or stuff that people write. It's all kind of in conversation with each other. And for me, that started with film. That doesn't necessarily have to be the place that everybody starts, but I do think it's a very easy place to start. So that was one of the goals in writing the book, was my hope that I could kind of encourage people to kind of, I don't know, maybe start engaging the world a little bit more critically, starting with movies.
I think you did an excellent job, Abby. I mean,
Thank you.
for your first book, but I would not read this and be like, "Oh, this must have been her first book." You seem like a seasoned writer, and one person speaking, I already love movies, but this absolutely, I don't know, invited me in further. And again, I already voiced this, but to start thinking about movies as more than just entertainment, and think a little more critically as I watch. Which, one of the movie series that I have tried to think most critically about, and just every time I do, I just appreciate it that much more and would love to talk
Hmm.
to you about, but I'll just ask one more question. But the Harry Potter series, I
Sure.
feel like it got so attacked, but as the years have gone by, I've been like, oh, that is a beautiful picture of so many gospel truths. I don't know if you can
Yeah. Oh,
get
for sure.
past
Like, yeah, as
your
somebody,
barriers
yeah,
to wizards and whatever.
yeah. As somebody who grew up, like, I was obsessed with the Harry Potter books, the entire series. The movies came. I was really right at like the prime age for that, because I think the first book came out when I was maybe 10 or 11, and
Okay.
I think the first movie came out when I was 13. So like, I really grew up alongside them, and it was a very similar experience for me too, where a lot of those themes were just, it's stuff that feels powerful, and it feels powerful for a reason. And for me,
Yeah.
that reason is that it comes from a place of truth. It comes
Hmm.
from an ultimate truth.
Yeah. Well, last question for you, Abby, and then I'll let you go.
Yeah,
If you could recommend three films to someone, I know there's a very general question.
oh gosh,
At least today, three new
yeah.
films to watch, what would those be?
Like, new as in like stuff that's come out within the
I
last
shouldn't
year.
say new.
Yeah.
If you just recommend top three films
Yeah.
as of today
um
you think someone
yeah,
should watch.
there's a movie that came out this last year called Janet Planet that
Okay.
I adore, by a woman named Annie Baker, that's about a mom and a daughter, in the early 90s, just kind of a summer together in their lives. And it's just a really beautiful observational portrait of that relationship. There's a movie also that came out last end of last year, or end of 2023 and early 2024. Sorry, I'm still on 2024 time.
No worries.
Called Perfect Days. And honestly, anything by the director Wim Wenders, I think, would be, it's worth checking out, because his
Okay.
stuff is so deeply, it's meditative and deeply observational and spiritual. So yeah, I really like Perfect Days. I also love Paris, Texas, which is an earlier film of his that's like one of my favorites of all time.
Okay.
Yeah, so those are just a few that are worth kind of
I admire
considering
the
checking
depth
out.
of knowledge that you have. Most of the movies that you've named today and directors, I have no idea
There you go.
who they are. So it's, I mean, there's a whole world of film beyond what shows up in the theater
Oh yeah,
that
for
is
sure. Yeah,
well worth
yeah. And
watching.
once you start digging, it's really hard to stop, is what I
Yeah,
found.
I bet.
So
Well, thanks so much, Abby. Thank you for the book. Thank you for your time. Thanks for the conversation.
yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was great.